Hey guys, it's me Kevin. I am back with another AFL video, and this time I'll be making a video on how every AFL club performed in the AFL Fantasy. So for those that don't know what AFL Fantasy is, it's basically a game where people can join and grab various different players from various different clubs, and they try to grab players to form a best 22 to generate as many points as possible. They get points from players, and that's decided by a bunch of stats from the players. So one day I was thinking, what if every AFL club had its own fantasy team, just full of its own players? How would they have performed if every player who played every game had their point fantasy scores contributed to their team's fantasy score? So I basically, at the end of the season, I basically added up each player in each team. I added all their scores up to form one total score for the club, and then I compiled a ladder based on their total score. So if you want to know what it looks like, this is what it looks like. Well, the bottom 10, that is. So this is the bottom 10 of the AFL Fantasy ladder. So in last spot, you've got Adelaide, which basically reflects their horror season, which they won their first ever wooden spoon. They were just pretty poor in general. 17th place is Hawthorn. Again, it reflects a pretty poor season for them. Gold Coast in 16th. That's a little bit of a surprise, despite the fact that they had 10 players score over 1,000, which I think was the equal most in the competition, but they had a lot of low-scoring players as well. Whilst in 15th, you had North Melbourne, which wasn't too bad, considering the fact that they only won 3 games all season. Finishing 15th was probably better than their overall ladder position. 14th was Carlton. 13th was probably the biggest surprise here. That was Richmond. Okay, now you might be thinking of this as a bad thing, and some people might be cursing me. How could Richmond be this low? No, think of it as a good thing. They're a team, not 22 individual players, unlike some opponent they played in some game last September. But the thing is with Richmond, they have a lot of role players, and they've got a team-orientated game plan. It's not really based on stars. It's a team, basically. And that's why Richmond have been so good, is that they play as a team. They've got a lot of good depth, a lot of role players, but they don't have a lot of star power outside. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. Well, okay, they've got quite a few stars, let's not forget. But I mean, like, they don't have the same amount as clubs like West Coast and Geelong do. And when they do, they don't perform extremely well week to week. They generally have their good moments. And also injuries did play a part, like Prestia and Hawley. They didn't play for large chunks of the season, so that kind of contributed. So yeah, Richmond, a team, but not 22 individual players. In 12th spot was Essendon, average, just like their team. 11th was Sydney, which is probably one of the bigger jumps, which shows that they're developing. They're not too bad. Yes, they've lost some games, but they've generally been quite competitive, their players. And then you've got 2 finals contenders, 10th Melbourne, and 9th would go to the Western Bulldogs, who only lost by 8 points. They only missed the top 8 by 8 points. So pretty heartbreaking for the Bulldogs. And if they look at the team that finished above them, then things get very interesting. So this is the top 8. Yes, the final opponent that the Bulldogs played overtook them into the top 8, Fremantle. So the Dogs might have won that game, but Fremantle managed to hold their 8th spot finish by just 8 points. 7th went to West Coast, partly due to injuries. 6th was GWS, which was a bit of a shock, and that further proves the 22 players theory. They might have a lot of talent, but they're not working together as a team. And that's the thing with AFL Fantasy, okay? It doesn't actually take into account the effectiveness of each stat. It just takes into account stat. So you could have like 30 disposals, okay? But It doesn't matter if you pass them to a player and it leads to a goal, if you just pass it to the boundary, or if you pass it to an opposition player, it doesn't matter. It's a disposal. So, yeah, there's no effectiveness. That's why GWS is in 6, because they might be getting a lot of ball, but yeah, they haven't been all that effective. 5th place is St Kilda, which coincides with their rise on the ladder. And that's despite the fact they don't have a lot of star power, but they're doing pretty well. 4th spot is Brisbane, despite the fact they've got Lockie Neal in their team. 3rd is Port Adelaide, who were the highest scoring team for like the first 4 rounds, and then they kind of faded out. 2nd place is a bit of a shock, Collingwood, but they've got some very, very good players on that team, like Treloar and Grundy, which kind of helped to their 2nd place finish. And on top of the ladder is Geelong, who had a lot of star players. I think they had 10 players finish with over 1,000 points, and I think another further 5 over 800, and they, even some of their lower ranked players were still getting in the 500s when others would only get about 200. So Geelong pretty consistent overall and finished with the minor premiership. Wait, did I say minor premiership? Yes, because it's not a true football competition without finals. Now, yes, I know what you're wondering. How can you decide a final series when not every team that's in the fantasy finals is in the real finals? Okay, you might be thinking that, but I decided to use the normal top 8 system where 1st place 4, 2nd place 3, you know the system. I used those matchups, and then I resorted to the same matchup earlier in the season, because let's face it, each team only played each other once this year, so it was a pretty easy exercise to do. So, for example, for Collingwood Port Adelaide in the 2nd qualifying final, I resorted to the round 18 matchup between the two sides, added all of the Collingwood players' scores up, and then compared them to Port Adelaide's score, where all the players had their scores added up, which would be somewhere in the low thousands. So basically, Port Adelaide beat Collingwood in round 18 and beat them in both areas, the fantasy and the actual game. Geelong beat Brisbane in round 6, and likewise their fantasy said so. Whilst the GWS West Coast game in round 13, despite the fact the Eagles won, GWS won the fantasy matchup. And lastly, Fremantle beat St Kilda all the way back in round 6 and would also go on to win the fantasy matchup. So yes, both sides that missed the finals in real time actually end up going through to the semis in fantasy. So, for the semis, Collingwood and GWS played in round 4. Despite the fact that GWS won the game, Collingwood won the fantasy matchup, whilst Brisbane beat Fremantle back in round 2, and their fantasy result reflects that. So, then they go towards the preliminary finals. In the first one, Geelong played Collingwood back in round 7, and Collingwood beat Geelong in both areas, both on the scoreboard and in fantasy. Likewise with Brisbane against Port Adelaide, when the two teams faced off in round 5, Brisbane went on to beat Port Adelaide in both areas. So that leads us to the grand final between Collingwood and Brisbane. The two teams played each other on a Friday night all the way back in round 15 at the Gabba. Although the key difference is that Collingwood is the home team in the grand final, while Brisbane was the home team in the actual game. But it doesn't really matter, it's just a jersey difference. That's about it. So, who won the 2020 AFL Fantasy Premiership? Collingwood, who beat Brisbane 13-27 to 12-47. And then there's the awards. So, the 2020 AFL Fantasy Minor Premiership went to Geelong on 24,034 points, whilst the 2020 AFL Fantasy Premiership went to Collingwood, beating Brisbane 13-27 to 12-47, which was played back in round 15. The highest scoring player of the year went to Lockie Neal, who scored 17,069 points, while the highest scoring first year player went to not Caleb Sarong, not Matt Rowell, although he was looking like he would take out the award after round 4, but none other than Matt Rowell's best friend, Noah Anderson, who was the only first-year player to score over 1,000 and scored 1058. Meanwhile, the player to have posted the highest score in an individual game was Marcus Bontempelli, who scored 145 against Adelaide all the way back in round 12, while the best on ground in the grand final was Jack Crisp, who scored 121 in the round 15 game against Brisbane. Now, luckily, if I were an AFL club, I would have finished above all of them, which is good because they're pretty low. You wouldn't want to be getting scores around what the AFL teams have got. But basically, I generated 28,531 points for the year to land myself in 21,818th position. I think that's off the top of my head anyway. So I guess it's an improvement from last year. I didn't do too well. It's somewhere in the mid-50s. And I wasn't that great last year. This year I've improved. Not entirely happy. I want to get higher for next year. But hey, the improvement counts. And obviously I know what to work on for next year. But anyway, that was the 2020 AFL Fantasy season. So I hope you liked this video. Please like, please subscribe, comment what you thought of the video down below, and how did you go in AFL Fantasy. Check out some of my other videos, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.